A rich gallery owner once offered me $40,000 for a table I built out of the wood from my dead wife's piano, and I told her no, and I threw her out of my workshop. 1 year later, I married her. Before I tell you how a woman I threw out became the love of my life and how my daughter saw what I couldn't do, me one favor. If you believe that the thing you make out of your grief can be the thing that finds you your future, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is built board by board, and it holds weight all the way to the end. Stay with me. My name is Isaiah Grant. I'm 41 years old. I'm a big man with big hands, and I make furniture out of wood the old way with hand tools and patience and no shortcuts. People call me a furniture maker. My grandfather, who taught me, called it something older. He called it listening to the wood. I used to say every board has a grain, a direction. It wants to go a truth inside it, and your whole job as a craftsman is not to force your idea onto the wood, but to find out what the wood already wants to be and help it get there. I didn't understand that as a boy. I thought he was being poetic. I understand it now. It took me losing everything to understand it, but I understand it now. I built my whole life with my hands. I built the workshop myself, a converted barn on a piece of land outside town, every joint of it mine. And I built it beside a woman named Naomi, who I married when I was 28. Naomi was a pianist, a real one, taught music at the community college, and played in a trio on weekends. And our whole marriage happened in the space between my sawdust and her music. She used to play in the evenings while I worked late in the shop, and the sound would carry across the yard, and I'd match my rhythm to hers without meaning to, planting a board in time to whatever she was playing. Her piano was the most beautiful thing we owned, an old upright. Her own grandmother had left her walnut with a grain so deep and alive that I used to run my hands over it and tell her it was the only piece of furniture in the house I hadn't made and wasn't jealous of. We had a daughter, Nia. And Nia somehow got Naomi's ear and my hands. And by the time she was 5, she was the kind of child who'd sit in my workshop building things out of scrap while her mother's music came across the yard, perfectly content humming along to a song while she hammered. There's a thing I remember about those years that tells you everything about what we had. On summer evenings, I'd leave the big shop door open and Naomi would play with the windows of the house open too, and Nia would run back and forth across the yard between us. From her mother's music to her father's sawdust, and back carrying things, a wood scrap to show Naomi a request for a song to bring to me a small ferry running between the two halves of her parents. And Naomi used to say that was the whole marriage right there, the two of us, on opposite sides of a yard doing the things we loved, and a child running happily between them, tying it all together. I didn't know then that I was living in the best years of my life. Nobody does. You only find out afterward, which is the cruelest design flaw in the whole arrangement. She was 7 when her mother died. Naomi died in a car accident on an icy road coming home from a weekend concert. I've made my peace with a lot of it, but not with the fact that she was doing the things she loved driving home from having made music when the road took her. It was sudden, and it was total, and it left me a widower with a 7-year-old and a house full of the sound of a piano that no one played anymore. That piano nearly broke me. I want to explain because it's the center of everything. After Naomi died, the piano sat in our living room silent, and I could not touch it, and I could not get rid of it. It was walnut, that deep living grain, and my wife's hands had worn the keys smooth over 30 years, and every time I walked past it, I heard the ghost of the music that used to come across the yard. Nia stopped going in that room. I stopped going in that room. The most beautiful thing we owned became a coffin in the middle of our house, and for 2 years, neither of us could look at it. And then one night, about 2 years after, I couldn't sleep, and I went and sat in that room in the dark, and I put my hands on the wood the way I used to, and I heard my grandfather's voice. Every board has a truth inside it, and I understood sitting there in the dark that the piano was not the music. The music was gone, the music left with Naomi. But the wood, the walnut, my wife's wood, worn by my wife's hands, that was still here, and it still had a truth inside it, and it did not want to be a coffin. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done with my hands. I took my wife's piano apart, carefully, reverently, over weeks, saving every piece. And out of the walnut, the good walnut, the wood her grandmother had left her, and her hands had worn smooth, I built a table, a dining table. A table meant to seat a family, meant to have meals on it, meant to be lived around instead of grieved around. I built it, the finest I have ever built anything, every joint hand-cut, and I inlaid the worn ivory of a few of the keys into the surface in a thin line down the center so that when we ate at it, we'd be eating at my wife's music transformed. Still here, still holding us up. Taking the piano apart was the strangest grief I've ever moved through, and I want to tell you about it because it changed me. I did it alone at night after Nia was asleep because I didn't want her to see it in pieces, didn't want her to walk in on her mother's piano looking like a body on a table. I unstrung it first, and the strings, when they came loose, made small dying sounds, the last notes that piano would ever make, and I stood there and let them go quiet one by one. I saved the good walnut, the case, the parts her grandmother's hands and her hands had touched, and I set aside the mechanical guts, the felts and hammers and the iron harp respectfully, the way you set aside the parts of anything that gave its life. And then I lived with those boards for weeks before I cut the first one, because you do not rush wood. Like that wood that carries that much, you sit with it until it tells you what it wants. And I sat with my wife's walnut in my quiet shop, night after night, until finally one night I saw the table in it, saw it whole the way my grandfather promised I would if I was patient enough, and only then did I pick up the saw. Every joint I cut by hand, no machines, because machines are fast and I did not want it to be fast. I wanted every hour of it to cost me something, wanted my grief to have somewhere to go besides the inside of my chest. The inlay was the hardest part. I took a few of the keys, the worn ivory, and I cut a thin channel down the center of the tabletop and set them in end to end, a single pale line running the length of the table like a melody laid flat, so that anyone sitting there would be sitting at my wife's music without even knowing it. And the ones who did know Nia and me would know exactly what was holding up their supper. It took me 6 months. And when it was done, Nia and I ate dinner at it for the first time, and my 9-year-old ran her fingers along the inlaid keys and said, "It still sounds like Mom, kind of, like Mom is holding up our plates." And I had to leave the room, and that was the first night in 2 years that either of us cried in a good way, a way that let something out instead of locking it in. I never meant to sell that table. It was never for sale. But word gets around in my line of work, and someone photographed it at a craft fair where I was showing other pieces, and the photo made its way to exactly the wrong, or maybe the exactly right person. Her name was Ava Sinclair, and she owned the most important craft and design gallery in the region, the kind of place that made careers, the kind of place I'd spent 20 years being too proud and too stubborn to try to get into. She drove out to my workshop unannounced on a Saturday in a car worth more than my barn, and she was, I'll be honest, exactly what I expected and had spent my whole career resenting. Polished, expensive, certain. Sandy blonde hair, a gray coat, the confident walk of someone who has never once been thrown out of anywhere. She walked into my shop like she was appraising it, which she was, and she found the table, my wife's piano. And she stopped dead in front of it and went quiet for a long time, and I watched her do the thing I'd watched no buyer ever do, which was reach out and touch the inlaid keys gently like she knew. "What is this?" she said. "That's not for sale," I said before she could ask. I already didn't like the way she was looking at it like a thing she wanted. "I'll give you $40,000 for it," she said, still looking at the table, not at me. "It should be in a museum. It's the finest piece I've seen in 10 years. Whoever you are, you should be famous, and this table should be seen." $40,000. I want you to understand what $40,000 was to me. It was 2 years of breathing room. It was Naya's future. It was the difference between scraping by and being okay. And I looked at this rich woman offering me 2 years of my life for the wood of my dead wife's piano, offering to take the thing that held up my daughter's plates and put it behind glass where no family would ever eat at it again. And something in me came up hot and fast. "Get out of my shop," I said. She blinked. I don't think anyone had told Ava Sinclair to get out of anywhere in a very long time. "Excuse me." "You heard me. That table is my wife. That's her piano, her grandmother's walnut. Her hands wore those keys smooth. My daughter eats her dinner at that table every night and says it feels like her mother is holding up her plate. And you want to put it behind glass so strangers can look at it. Get out of my shop." My hands were shaking. "You people. You think everything has a price. You think you can buy a thing and understand it. You don't understand the first thing about that table, and you never will, and I wouldn't sell it to you for $400,000. Get out." And Ava Sinclair, to her credit, did not argue. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she looked at the table, and something moved across her polished face that I didn't have time to read, and she said quietly, "I'm sorry." I misunderstood what I was looking at. And she left, and I stood in my shop shaking, feeling righteous. Feeling like I'd defended my wife, and it took me a long time to understand that the look on her face when she left hadn't been offense. It had been recognition. She'd understood exactly what she was looking at. That was the problem. She'd understood better than I gave her credit for, and I'd thrown her out anyway because it was easier to be angry at a rich stranger than to sit with the fact that my wife's piano had become a table that a stranger could see was made of pure love. Here's the part I didn't know. Nia had been in the shop, up in the loft where she liked to read quiet, and she'd heard the whole thing. And that night at dinner at that very table, my daughter, who was 10 by then, looked at me and said something that has stayed with me ever since. She said, "Dad, that lady wasn't trying to steal Mom. She was trying to tell you the table was beautiful. You yelled at her for telling you Mom's table was beautiful." And she went back to her dinner 10 years old, having seen the entire thing more clearly in one sentence than I'd managed to see it all day. I didn't do anything about it for a while. Pride is a slow thing to climb down from, but it worked on me. Nia's sentence all through that winter. And in the spring, I did something I'd never done in my life. I wrote a letter by hand to the gallery to Ava Sinclair, and I apologized. I told her I was sorry for throwing her out. I told her she'd been right, that the table was made of love, and that I'd been angry not at her, but at the fact that she could see it. And I said that the table would never be for sale, but that if she was still interested in my other work and the things I made that were meant to be sold, I'd be honored to show them to her. I mailed it and felt like a fool and didn't expect an answer. She answered in person. Drove back out to the shop on a Saturday again, and this time she didn't walk in appraising anything. She walked in careful, almost shy, holding my letter, which she'd kept. And she said, "I've read this maybe 40 times. Nobody has ever apologized to me before. I don't think anyone has ever thought they needed to." And then she said the thing that started everything. "I lied to you that first day, or I didn't tell you the whole truth. When I offered you $40,000 for that table, it wasn't because I wanted to sell it. I have money. I didn't need it to make me money. I wanted it. Because when I touched those keys, I felt something I hadn't felt in 15 years of looking at beautiful objects for a living. I felt like the person who made it had loved somebody the way I've always wanted to be loved and never have been. And I couldn't buy that. So I tried to buy the table instead. It was the closest thing available." She laughed, embarrassed. "You were right to throw me out. I was trying to buy love off a shelf. Again." I learned about Ava Sinclair slowly after that, the way you learn about anyone worth knowing. She'd built her gallery from nothing, worked her way up from a girl who dusted display cases into the woman who owned them, and she'd sacrificed everything else on the way, the relationships, the family. All of it, poured herself entirely into the one thing she could control, which was recognizing beauty and selling it. She had spent her entire adult life surrounded by the most beautiful things human hands could make, and she had never once been loved the way the makers of those things loved. She said she'd handled 1,000 objects made out of love and never been the object of any. She was underneath the gray coat and the expensive car, one of the loneliest people I have ever met, a woman who could recognize love in a piece of walnut from across a room and had never been able to find it aimed at herself. And Nia adored her. That's what I didn't see coming. My daughter, who had been so protective of her mother's memory, took to Ava completely, and I finally understood why when I watched them together in the shop one afternoon. Ava treated Nia like a fellow artist. She didn't talk down to her, didn't do the voice adults do. She looked at the things Nia built out of scrap wood, and she critiqued them seriously, honestly, the way she'd critique a real maker. And Nia, who had her mother's ear and her father's hands, and a hunger to be taken seriously that I'd been too grief-blind to notice, bloomed under it. "This joint is weak," I heard Ava tell her, "but this curve right here, this is real. You have an eye for line that can't be taught." And my daughter looked at this woman like she'd handed her the sun. Ava saw Nia. That was her gift, the thing she'd made a career of, seeing what was beautiful and true in a thing and naming it out loud. She just aimed it at my daughter instead of at merchandise, and my daughter had needed exactly that her whole life and never gotten it. Ava started coming out to the shop most weekends at first, with the excuse of showing my sellable work in her gallery, which she did, and which changed my career. I won't pretend it didn't. Doors opened that 20 years of stubbornness had kept shut. But the excuse wore thinner and thinner. She'd arrive with the paperwork, and then somehow the paperwork would get done in 20 minutes. And she'd still be there at dark, sitting on a stool, watching me work, or in the loft with Nia, or just walking the yard. I caught myself one evening planning a board in a rhythm, and I realized with a jolt that I was doing the thing I used to do to Naomi's music, matching my hands to something, except there was no music. There was just Ava's presence in the shop, and my body had started keeping time to a person again. I put the plane down and had to go stand outside for a minute, because I didn't know what to do with that. With the discovery that some frozen clock inside me had quietly started ticking again. We circled each other for months like that, both of us too scarred to name it. She'd been hurt by people who only wanted what she could give them, and I'd been hollowed out by a loss. I didn't think I had the right to move past, and so we were careful. Careful, two careful people orbiting a table made out of a dead woman's piano. But Nia saw it long before either of us admitted it. "You should ask Ava to stay for dinner," she started saying casually, too casually, a 10-year-old playing matchmaker with the subtlety of a hammer. And Ava would stay for dinner at the table, and the three of us would eat at my wife's music, and it should have felt like a betrayal. And somehow it felt like the opposite. It felt like the table was doing exactly what a table is for, which is to have people at it. But I have to tell you about the day it almost fell apart, because a happy ending you didn't have to swallow your pride for isn't worth telling. Ava's gallery was in trouble. I didn't know it because she was proud in the same way I was proud, and she hid it. But the truth was that the kind of place she ran, the careful, curated, human kind of place, was dying, squeezed out by cheaper things made faster in factories, and Ava was quietly losing the gallery she'd given her whole life to build. She got an offer that autumn from a big commercial chain to buy her out. Keep the name, turn her careful gallery into another location, selling mass-produced things that looked handmade. It would have saved her financially. It would have erased everything she actually was. And she was going to take it because she was out of options. And she came to tell me she was selling, and selling meant leaving, moving to the city where the corporate job was. And she said it standing in my shop with her chin up and her voice steady, giving me the same speech I imagine she gave everyone about how it had been lovely and she'd never forget us, and she wished us well. And I did the thing I'd learned to do too late with everyone else in my life. I almost let her go. I almost stood there in my pride and my grief and let another good thing walk out of my shop, because reaching for it meant risking it, and I'd already lost a wife, and I did not think I could survive losing anyone else. I opened my mouth to wish her well. And Nia, my Nia, 11 by then, who was up in the loft again, who was always up in the loft, hearing everything called down from the rafters, "Dad, don't be dumb again." That's it. That's what she said. "Don't be dumb again." And Ava looked up at the loft, startled, and then she looked at me, and I looked at my daughter's face hanging over the railing. Fierce and certain, the same face that had told me 2 years before that I'd yelled at a woman for saying my wife's table was beautiful. And I climbed down off my pride one more time, faster this time, because I was learning. "Don't sell the gallery," I said. "Or sell it. I don't care about the gallery. Don't leave. Ava, I threw you out of my shop a year ago because you could see how much I loved my wife, and it terrified me because it meant you could see. And you've been seeing all of us ever since, seeing Nia, seeing me, and I've been letting you because I'm a coward who'd rather be seen than have to say anything about it. So I'm going to say something about it. Don't take the corporate job. Don't move to the city. Stay here and be seen back for once in your life. Let me build you a life instead of you selling everybody else's. Marry me. I'm asking you to marry me. I know it's fast, and I know I threw you out of here a year ago, and I'm asking anyway." Ava Sinclair, who could name the beauty in any object ever made by human hands, stood in my sawdust and could not for once find a single word. And then she said, "Nobody has ever asked to build me anything. My whole life, people asked me to sell them things. Nobody ever offered to make me something." And she started to cry, this composed woman in my workshop, and Nia climbed down out of the loft and stood next to her, and the three of us stood around the table made of my wife's piano. And I understood that Naomi had somehow held up our plates long enough to seat one more person at the table. I found out later how bad it had really gotten. How many months she'd been quietly covering the gallery's losses out of her own savings. How she'd let go of the 2 employees she loved because she couldn't make payroll. How she'd sat alone in that beautiful room, full of beautiful things, surrounded by other people's love rendered in wood and glass and clay. Going broke, too proud to tell a soul. The corporate offer wasn't greed, it was drowning. And the cruelest part of it, the part that made me climb down off my pride faster than I ever had, was understanding that Ava had spent her whole life being the person who recognized value in things everyone else overlooked, and she was about to disappear into a corporation precisely because no one had ever recognized the value in her. She could see everyone. No one could see her. And I, who had been so busy protecting a table, had almost let the one person who'd seen all of us vanish into a job that would have erased her for the same reason I almost lose everything, because reaching out feels like exposure, and I'd rather be safe and alone than seen and at risk. She didn't sell to the corporate chain. What she did instead, and this was Nia's idea, I want that on the record, was turn the gallery into something new. A gallery that only sold work made by hand by real makers, and that taught too, that had a workshop in the back where kids like Nia could learn to listen to the wood. And I taught there 2 days a week, and Ava ran the front, and it did not make anyone rich. But it stopped dying because it turned out there were more people than the corporate chain believed who still wanted things made out of love and were willing to pay honestly for them. Ava had spent her life selling beauty. She spent the rest of it growing it instead. Before I asked Ava to marry me, before any of it, there was one thing I had to do, and I did it alone, and I've never told her the whole of it. I went and sat at the table one last time by myself, and I put my hands on the walnut on Naomi's wood, and I talked to my wife. I told her about Ava. I told her that I hadn't gone looking for anyone, that I'd thrown the woman out of my own shop, that Nia had seen it before I did. And I told her that I thought she'd like Ava, that Ava saw people the way Naomi heard them, that they were two versions of the same gift. And I asked her out loud in an empty room whether it was all right. I don't believe in ghosts, but I believe in wood, and I believe every board has a truth in it. And when I put my hands flat on that table and asked my dead wife whether I was allowed to love again, the answer that came up through the walnut into my hands was the same answer the table had been giving me for 3 years. Tables are for gathering around. Bring more people to it. That's what it's for. That's what I'm for. We were married at the workshop in the spring, and we ate the wedding dinner at the table. My wife's piano seating our family and our friends and the makers. Ava had spent her life championing the inlaid ivory keys running down the center like a melody you could touch. Nia gave a toast 12 years old, and she said, "My mom was music and my dad is wood, and this table is both of them at the same time. And now Ava's here too, and Ava's the one who could see it. My mom made things you could hear, and my dad makes things you can touch, and Ava finds the things that are real and tells everybody. So now we've got all three, hearing, touching, and finding." And she sat down, and I don't think there was a person at that table who understood their own life as well as my 12-year-old understood ours. The table is still in our house. We still eat at it every night, the three of us. Ava runs her hands over the inlaid keys, sometimes the way I used to run mine over the piano, and she says she still can't believe she gets to eat at it instead of sell it, that the most beautiful thing she ever found in 20 years of looking. She gets to have dinner at every single day for free. Nia is 15 now and building real furniture, and it's good. Genuinely good, better than I was at her age, and she's got her mother's ear and my hands and Ava's eye, all three, and she says she doesn't want to choose between making things and selling things and teaching things. She wants to do what Ava did and change the whole shape of it so nobody has to choose. My grandfather told me that every board has a truth inside it, and your job is to find what the wood wants to be. I spent 2 years thinking my wife's piano wanted to be a coffin. It didn't. It wanted to be a table, a thing to gather around, a thing that holds up plates and holds up a family, and it turned out holds up a future I couldn't see coming. Seated a woman I threw out of my own shop because she was the one person who walked in and could see at a single touch exactly what the wood had always wanted to be. If you made it all the way here, then you already know this was never really a story about a table. It was a story about pride, and about how the thing we're most afraid of is being truly seen, and about the people brave enough to see us anyway, and stubborn enough to stay. So before you go, do this one thing for me. If there is someone in your life who saw you clearly, saw the thing you were hiding and didn't look away, put their name in the comments, just the name. Let them be seen for 1 second in a place they'll never see. And if this story reached you, subscribe and stay with me, because I've got more of them. True ones, hard ones. Stories about the things we build out of grief and the people who can see what they're really made of. The next one begins the way all the good ones do, with someone standing in front of the thing they love most, too proud and too scared to let anyone else near it. Because that, it turns out, is almost always the exact moment before someone walks in, reaches out, and touches it like they already know.